Hey there, how there, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond welcoming you to yet another Cutter Top 10 NHL playoff video. And today we're going to be looking at the top 10 NHL round 2 upsets. Well, of course, round 2 is a lot different nowadays as it was in the old days. In the old days, the round 2 would be basically your quarterfinals, if you will. You go from like 12 teams down to 8 in the mid 70s. That's quarterfinals, or as we call it, the division finals in the 80s to like early 90s conference semifinals, and then your kind of division finals nowadays. So I found 10 massive upsets that shocked the hockey world and all of that. And of course, as I am wearing the Leaf jersey, that's what it is. And yes, there is one Leaf one on here, one to involve the Leafs. Just saying. It was actually hard to find 10 upsets because I had a document, but then, things happened. Number 10 is Rangers Devils 1997. If you're thinking, well, how's this an upset? Well, the Rangers were the ones who upset the Devils. The Rangers had a lot of things going for them. 94, they were the Stanley Cup champs. 3 years later, in 97, they weren't really the best team around. They did get Wayne Gretzky in free agency. After all, Vancouver and Toronto both dropped the ball on Gretzky, especially Toronto, who had a deal, and Gretzky was going to play there. He wanted to play there for at least a year. But Steve Stafford, owner of the Leafs, basically snarked, how many seats will that fill? Even though Maple Leaf Gardens gets sold every time. So he practically didn't give him the offer, and Gretzky took the Rangers deal. Gretzky and Messier would help the Rangers beat the Panthers in the first round in 97. And the Devils in 97, first round was against the Habs. That was when, of course, Martin Brodeur scored that empty net goal in the playoffs. Anyway, Rangers Devils always was tough. 94 was a 7-game conference final, masterclass. Unfortunately, though, the Devils were much better than the Rangers. We're supposed to go to the conference finals, but somehow, in some freaking way, they didn't falter. And the Rangers won in 5 games thanks to Adam Graves' overtime winner in Game 5, which was big. And the Devils fell flat on their butts. It would take them a few years to get back into things. 98, they actually got shocked in the first round by the Senators. Bet you didn't know that. All right. Number 9 is Carolina Montreal 2002. So Carolina was just coming in their own. In 1986, when they were the Hartford Whalers, they won the playoff series against the Quebec Nordiques. Little did they know it would take 16 years for that franchise, Hartford/Carolina, to win a playoff series, and they did so against the Devils. They would take on the Montreal Canadiens, who actually shocked the Bruins in 6 games to make it through. Montreal were a spunky team, and Jose Theodore made that famous stick save off of Bill Guerin in Game 6. Unfortunately for Montreal, they figured they were in trouble. Carolina did beat New Jersey in the first round, which was shocking. So, yeah, Montreal and Carolina were battled tooth and nail. Montreal were one period away from going up 3 games to 1 on the Canes, and then they fell flat. And the Canes did what they called the Molson miracle, scoring 3 goals in the third period to tie the game and force overtime. Oh, probably like Ashian, Nick Wallin, the hero. The Canes would beat the Habs in Game 6, 8-2, and that series that was memorable for Doug Gilmour, who was playing for the Habs, getting mad after a penalty and actually smashing the penalty door so badly that the glass shattered, and it was actually one of those rare laughing fits from the commentators and all that. But yeah, Carolina got to the conference finals against the Leafs and sent the Leafs home. It would have been amazing to see Montreal versus Toronto, or Montreal versus Ottawa for that fact, because the Leafs and Senators were in the other conference semifinal. If Montreal had pulled it off, Montreal would have been playing either their old rivals from the 1920s, the Ottawa Senators, or their eternal rivals, Toronto Maple Leafs, for a trip to the Stanley Cup Finals, probably to get beaten, but still, that would have been amazing. And of course, 2002 is, of course, massive side note is that the Leafs Senators series, that was one of my most memorable times spending time with my dad, who, of course, died in 2020, because we were discussing the Leafs Senators stuff during Game 6, and of course, my mom had to work at the nursing home. Anyway, number 8 is Wild Canucks 2003. Minnesota were a massive Cinderella. So were the Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks took care of the defending Stanley Cup champion Detroit Red Wings in the first round. But the Ducks had an easier time with Dallas, it seemed. Wild and Canucks were a bigger upset. Minnesota came back from 3-1 down against the Colorado Avalanche and ruined Patrick Roy's career. Roy had to retire. However, Minnesota would also fall 3-1 to the Canucks, and it looked like Vancouver had basically been putting on a clinic. Weirdly enough, Vancouver was down 3-1 to St. Louis in the first round, coming back to win. So yeah, Canucks were up 3-1, and it looked like Vancouver were going to the conference finals. Not so fast, as the Minnesota Wild would put on 3 straight wins to take down the Canucks and ruin everything. Get themselves into an unlikely conference final against the Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks won because the Wild could only score one freaking goal in 4 games against Shea Shagar. All that. Number 7 happened the next year, 2004, as the Flames took on the Wings in the second round. Calgary had to fight off Vancouver thanks to a Martin Gelinas Game 7 overtime goal to sink his former team, the Canucks. And he played for them in the 94 Stanley Cup Finals. That moment just hit me. Detroit had an easy time in Nashville in the playoffs. So anyway, Flames, Wings, everyone thought Detroit was going to knock out Calgary and basically ruin everything. However, Calgary's spunkiness inspired the Red Mile, down 17th Street in Calgary. Series was 3-2 Flames going to Game 6 in Calgary, and then in overtime, late in the first overtime, a back pass. Martin Gelinas was almost wide open, and he scored past Cujo, and the Flames were going to the Stanley Cup semifinals. They would take out the San Jose Sharks in the conference finals and should have taken out the Tampa Bay Lightning in Game 6 of the Stanley Cup finals, but stupid replay stuff. Anyway, number 6 is Oilers Sharks 2006. So, of course, 2005 had that lockout, and then 2006 happened. Another Alberta team pulled off one of the biggest upsets around. The Oilers were an 8 seed. They were expected to get beaten by the Red Wings, but strange enough, for the second straight postseason, the Red Wings lost to a team from Alberta. So the Oilers were taking on the Sharks. Edmonton was down 2-0, and it looked big. But then in triple overtime, Alex Hemsky scored a big goal in Game 3, and I think they scored overtime in Game 5 or something like that. Game 4. But the Oilers took care of the Sharks in 6 games, and the Sharks couldn't believe it. They picked up Joe Ferdinand in that big trade with Boston, which was one of the most lopsided NHL trades of all time. But the Oilers won that game, won the conference finals against who did they beat in the conference finals? I can't remember. I can't remember for the life of me. I would say they beat Detroit, they beat San Jose. Who did they beat in round 3? I don't remember. Well, it doesn't matter. The Oilers lost the Stanley Cup Finals. Number 5 is the Islanders Penguins 1975. In 1975, the New York Islanders were just completed their 3rd season of existence. But they had one of the best upward trajectories you can bet on. Their first season, they sucked. They were given the number 1 draft pick, and they kept the pick, taking Dennis Potvin, a defenseman from Quebec. Montreal was so gung-ho on Dennis Potvin, they offered 5 NHL players to the Islanders, and Bill Torrey told the Habs to pump a stump. And then by their 3rd season, the Islanders were good enough to make the playoffs. They beat the Rangers in the preliminary round to take on the Pens in the quarterfinals. Back when Pittsburgh was decent, and of course back when Pittsburgh were close to insolvency and all that. Of course, we all know about the Mario Lemieux situation. But still, 1975, the Pens were almost sold every year to a new buyer and all that. The Penguins were up 3-0, and it looked like Pittsburgh was going to the Stanley Cup semifinals. Imagine a team getting to the Stanley Cup semifinals before Mario Lemieux's time. Anyway, the Islanders somehow won 4 straight games. Chico Resch, who was the first goalie to have a geographical design on his mask, the thing of Long Island, came up big, and the Islanders shocked the Penguins in 4 straight games after that to win the series. They were actually down 3-0 to the Flyers, but they fell to the Flyers in Game 7. That was big. Number 4 is the Flyers. Speaking of the Flyers, against the Boston Bruins 2010. This was a massive upset of massive upsets. Of all the teams to be down 3-0 to win in Game 7, this was one of the biggest ones. Yes, we know the Islanders Pens, and that was a 1-0 game, but the Flyers Bruins Game 7 was even bigger. The Bruins were up 3-0. The Flyers were playing musical chairs with Layden, Boucher, and can't remember the other goalie for Philly. Ash, I think? I don't remember. But yeah, they were playing musical chairs with their goalies. Simon Gagne scored an innocent overtime winning goal in Game 4 to force Game 5 in Boston. Boston lost it. And then the Flyers ended up winning Game 6 on home ice. So it was Game 7 in Boston. It was Brian Boucher versus Tuukka Rask. Yeah, Tim Thomas was not the main goalie for Boston that year. That was Tuukka's time. And of course, Toronto wishes they had never got rid of that guy. So anyway, the Flyers came back from 3-0 down to win Game 7. But what's even bigger, and people forget about this, is that the Flyers actually were down 3-0 in games and in goals. They were down 3-0 in Game 7 and came back to win. Can you imagine being down by 3 goals in Game 7 and coming back to win? Shut up. I know what you're thinking. I'm a Leaf fan. I should talk. But that was different. The Flyers were down 3-0 in the game, and Boston almost blew them out of the fucking water. But yeah, the Flyers used the momentum to beat the Habs in the conference finals, go to the Stanley Cup finals, and get beaten by Kane in 6 games. Number 3 is the Leafs Islanders 1978. You would probably thought I was going to make it number 1, but no, I am not making this number 1. I'm making this number 3 for a main reason. Anyhow, so the Leafs had to beat the Kings in the preliminary round to get to the quarterfinals against the New York Islanders. The Islanders were salivating. They were even better than the 75 squad, obviously. Chico Resch was the main goalie, not Billy Smith, which was shocking. But yeah, the Islanders held their own. The Islanders won the first 2 games at home, and then the Leafs won games 3 and 4 at MLG. Islanders won game 5 in overtime at home. Game 6, the Leafs basically put Mike Bossy on the shelf. So it was up to game 7, and it was 1-1 after 60 minutes. And it was like unbelievable. I know it was a Saturday night game, but shockingly, it was Dan Kelly behind the mic for CBC and not Toronto's Bill Hewitt. But the fact is, the Leafs and the Islanders came by. There was a flip pass. Lady McDonald wearing a cage because of an injury somehow found the puck and slid it past Chico Resch to make it the win for the Leafs. And it was like amazing how the Toronto Maple Leafs could take care of the powerful New York Islanders in 7 games. The Leafs had not had many great moments in the playoffs since 1967 when they won the Cup. So the Leafs were going to their first Stanley Cup semifinals in 11 years. They got swept by the Habs, but who cared? They beat up on those pesky New York Islanders. The worst part was the Islanders also fell in the Stanley Cup semifinals to the Rangers in 1979 before finally winning 4 in a row. So, yeah. Numbers 1 and 2 was hard to pick. But due to things, I'm going to say number 2 is Oilers Flames 86. I know 1 and 2 could be interchangeable. So the Oilers were massive juggernauts. In 1983, they got to the Stanley Cup Finals. They ended up falling to the Islanders. That was when they realized that playoff hockey was big because the the players were just icing down their wounds and all that. So the Oilers remembered that now it was not a sprint; it was a marathon. Oilers in 1982 could have been the Western Conference champs, but unfortunately they fell to the Kings in the first round. But anyhow, the Oilers won the Cup in 84 and 85. We're looking to three-peat in 86. They had the team worthy to do it. They took on their pesky provincial rivals, the Calgary Flames. It was down to things. It was 3 games all going to game 7 at Northlands. Don Whitman on the call for CBC. Mike Lang, remember him, Pittsburgh guy, for ESPN when they did NHL hockey in the 1980s. Bet you didn't know that. I didn't. But anyway, it was down to the wire and all that. And so things had to happen to make things happen. So anyway, it didn't happen much, but it happened a lot. So Oilers and Flames game 7. Flames were up 2-0, but then a pair of goals made it 2-2. And then came the moment with 7 minutes left in the third period as Grant Fuhr was going to touch the puck and all that and touched it for Steve Smith. Steve Smith was trying to throw a cross crease pass to Don Jackson, and unfortunately for Smith, it banked off Steve Smith's uh no yeah Steve Smith, but it damaged off Grant Fuhr's leg and all that. And the Oilers were down 3 games. Was down 3-2. There was still time for the Oilers to make things right, but they failed. The Flames shocked the Oilers, won Game 7. They had to go through 7 games with the Blues because they lost Game 6 on what they called the Monday Night Miracle, the NHL version. But the Flames won Game 7, took on the Habs in the Stanley Cup Finals against a young Patrick Roy. But unfortunately, Patrick Roy sunk the Flames. Obviously, the Oilers definitely would have won the Stanley Cup if they had a chance to take care of those pesky Montreal Canadiens. It ruined their three-peat. Steve Smith was basically ostracized in Edmonton, even though that Steve Smith and the Oilers did win 2 Stanley Cups in 87 and 88, especially when Gretzky, after winning the Cup against the Flyers, gave Steve Smith the first turn with the Stanley Cup because of the mistake. There were a lot of problems and all that. And unfortunately, though, the Oilers couldn't believe it. But yeah, the Oilers could have had their drive for 5, winning the Stanley Cups. Yeah, Steve Smith was still ostracized, and basically he was run out of town to Chicago in 1991. And number 1, based on the fact that this team was actually a bigger underdog than the Flames in 86, is the New York Islanders against the Pittsburgh Penguins 1993. I ranked the Game 7 overtime winner by the Islander guy number 1 in my number 1 second round overtime goals of all time. So it's easy to say that the Islanders Penguins were the biggest second round upset of all time. So the New York Islanders were spunky and all that. They had to take on the Capitals in the divisional semis. They scored 3 straight overtime goals. They won the game, and of course that was when Dale Hunter went bonkers and hurt Pierre Turgeon. And of course got himself a 21-game suspension to start the 1994 season. But the fact of the matter is that the Islanders were out of their element. It was the freaking Pittsburgh Penguins who were going to do it. The simple fact is that the Penguins were the 2-time defending Stanley Cup champs. They won 17 straight games near the end of the 93 season. They won 17 straight games. They didn't have any ties and all that. They had overtime. Help them a couple times. But the simple fact is that, yeah, the Penguins were looking to three-peat and all that, and the Islanders were not doing so well. The Islanders did one thing possible. Darius Kasparaitis and a few other people would whack Mario Lemieux. Basically, take down Lemieux, take down the Penguins, although it didn't completely work. They went to Game 7 in Pittsburgh. Islanders were up by 2 goals, but the Penguins tied the game late, and then they went on a stupid 2-on-1 that failed, and the Oilers went on a 2-on-1. And David Folek, who's a slow skater and a slow defensive forward, actually ended up sliding the puck in the net past Tom Barrasso, giving the New York Islanders the shocking win over the Pittsburgh Penguins and sinking the 2-time Stanley Cup champions, with the great Al Arbor still behind the bench for the Islanders. It was just unbelievable. It actually helped Montreal out because it would have been Lemieux versus Roy in the Stanley Cup semifinals, but it wasn't. It was Islanders versus Montreal. Montreal took care of the Islanders in 5 and won the Stanley Cup against the Kings in 5. So Patrick Roy better be giving the New York Islanders and Al Arbor a fucking fruit basket. I mean, he won't because the Islanders fired Patrick Roy as coach, and that bit them in the ass. Really, it did. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond at Duke.